A single drone guided by simple code can defeat a tank that costs millions, and that imbalance is only the latest turn in a very old story. What did the first fighters think they were inventing when they lifted a sharpened stick and hunted in a circle? How did tools for survival become tools of organized force? In this video, we will answer this question and explain the history of warfare over the ages. But before we do, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more ominous history content. We greatly appreciate your support. 200,000 BC sticks, stones, and strategy. The oldest weapons look humble in a museum case, yet they carried ideas as powerful as any modern plan. Early humans learned that a stick thrown as a spear extends the body, and that a stone shaped into an edge turns fragile flesh into a decisive force. Cooperation mattered more than muscle, because a circle of hunters could channel an animal into a narrow space and strike at the right moment. Those rhythms became the first tactics, and memory turned lessons into shared doctrine. A community that remembered a successful hunt could repeat it against rivals as well as prey. Why would a hunter watch the wind and the shadows before moving a foot? Scent matters to animals, and so do lines of sight, and people learned to reverse those truths against other people. Ambushes appeared long before cities because timing and terrain favored the patient. A group that knew how to separate a target from help could win without a fair fight, and that preference for advantage survived every later age. Even without metal, a sharpened point and a chosen ground created control. Distance changed courage into calculation in these early struggles. A thrown stone risks less than a grapple at arm's length, and a barrage of rocks can collapse the will of a larger foe. Shields began as simple bark or woven reeds, and they did not need to be perfect to make a difference. A handful of defenders behind a log line could withstand a rush, and the first rough palisades grew from that logic. The lesson that cover decides outcomes never left warfare. Fire joined the toolkit and sharpened the edge of fear. A torch waved in the night is not only heat, but also shock, and animals flee from light in a way that human fighters learned to exploit. The line between ritual and intimidation blurred as crackling flames reduced distance into uncertainty. If a foe cannot see your approach becomes inevitable in their mind. That first psychology of battle mattered as much as any weapon. What does victory mean to a small band that shares the same water and the same trails? Control of a spring or a safe sleeping place can decide whether children live through a season, and so every encounter carried high stakes. The pattern of scouting, feinting, shouting, and striking formed in miniature, and time refined it into rules. The first warriors carried no banners and built no walls, yet their choices established the grammar that all later armies still speak in different accents. 6,000 BC walls, villages, and raids. Farming rewrote the battlefield by fixing people to a place and inviting defense. A field of grain needs months of quiet to ripen, and that requirement pulled families into tight clusters with ditches, stakes, and low walls. A palisade is a promise to stay, and raiders test promises as soon as they see them. The rhythm of sowing and harvest created windows of vulnerability that clever opponents learned to read. With homes to protect, communities trained watchkeepers and built alarms as carefully as they shaped clay pots. Why would a raider risk injury for a few sacks of grain? Food stores concentrate calories in a way that appeals to wolves and men alike, and a night raid offers quick profit without a long fight. Defenders answered with thicker gates and elevated platforms, then with towers that offered sightlines across the fields. The rise of sentries created a new social role and turned vigilance into a habit. The idea that information buys time began on those wooden walkways. Tools for farming bled into tools for combat as adzes became axes and sickles stiffened into cutting blades. A hoe can break a skull, but a purpose-made club does the job cleaner and faster, and artisans rose to meet that demand. Specialization arrived quietly in these settlements as full-time makers traded tools for grain rights. The economy of protection took shape, and with it came expectations about service, reward, and leadership. Rituals and rules appeared because permanent neighbors require limits on violence. Feuds that burn through a season can ruin a harvest. so elders and priests created boundaries and mediators. Yet when tempers flared across a boundary stone, everyone understood what was at stake. A raid that took cattle or captives carried both wealth and warning, and communities marked such events in memory and myth. The stories passed down taught children who to fear and who to trust. What happens when one village builds a wall that stands taller than any ladder in reach? The answer is a race to learn new ways to climb or to undermine, and that race drives invention. Trenches, berms, and gates evolved into planned defenses with choke points, killing fields, and escape routes. The map of a village became a silent instructor that told defenders where to stand and taught attackers where they would bleed. The blueprint for fortification was born in mud and timber. 1500 BC, Bronze Age states and the Chariot Age. Metal did not end conflict, but it changed the scale and speed of ambition. Bronze swords kept an edge that bone could not match, and bronze spearheads punched through hides and woven armor. More important than the blade was the bureaucracy that furnished it in numbers, because palace workshops turned elite gear into state power. When a ruler could issue hundreds of identical points, an army could drill in unison and trust that a replacement existed for every broken haft. Logistics revealed itself as a kingmaker. Why did the chariot feel like a miracle when it first rolled across a plain? 2 horses pulling a light frame carry speed and status, and the archer aboard can fire accurately while moving. The combination of mobility and precision shattered static lines and spread fear faster than a messenger could speak. Chariot nobles carved prestige into the landscape, and courts composed hymns to celebrate the union of wheel and bow. The battlefield became a stage for coordinated performance. Rivers, roads, and tribute tied cities to capitals in this era, and campaigns turned into circuits that followed harvest timetables. Armies marched to collect grain, prisoners, and pledges from allied lords, and the threat of chariot raids kept wavering towns cooperative. Writing reinforced command as tablets recorded rations, routes, and contingent duties with a neatness that felt like control. The idea that administration equals advantage took root in archives. Siegecraft matured because not every city opened its gates to a parade of chariots. Earthen ramps crept toward walls while sappers dug to collapse foundations. Towers raised archers above parapets, and shield formations protected those who labored under thrown stones. Agreements often ended the work, but every successful breach taught a sharper lesson. The slow grind against masonry guided minds toward the art of pressure. What do we make of a world where kings measured power by the number of wheels they could field? The Chariot Age put aristocrats at the center of battle and encouraged rituals that kept that circle tight. Yet storms, famine, and migrations could roll back even the most splendid court. The very speed that defined the age could disperse it when horses starved and wheels broke. Innovation moves in tides, and this tide taught states how quickly prestige can run aground. 500 BC infantry revolutions in the classical world. When farmers formed ranks with long spears and broad shields, they discovered a different answer to fear. A wall of men shoulder to shoulder holds more firmly than any single champion, and discipline converts ordinary citizens into an engine of shock. The phalanx required practice, courage, and trust, and its success linked military virtue to civic identity. Cities that marched together voted together, and the square of spears became a school for public life. Why would anyone stand still while projectiles sang across the air? The truth is that formations moved like living creatures, advancing and wheeling with a rhythm that made bravery contagious. Skirmishers screened the heavy foot and punished the careless, and cavalry probed for edges. What mattered most was cohesion at the moment of impact, because a wavering front could unspool into panic in a heartbeat. Training transformed nerves into staying power. Armor and weapons became a conversation between cost and protection. Bronze breastplates gave way to layered linen or leather for those of modest means, and the balance between fatigue and safety tilted with every campaign. Spears lengthened to gain reach, and short swords waited for the crush when lines locked at kissing distance. The intimate brutality of this fighting left deep marks on families and laws, and poets found new words for courage and grief. Commanders learned to combine troops rather than worship a single method. Light infantry opened paths that heavy infantry could widen, and cavalry exploited cracks that appeared under pressure. The birth of combined arms in this era was not a proclamation, but a practice, and the most flexible leaders harvested the best results. It is one thing to own fine equipment, and another to synchronize it across a hill full of dust and shouting. What remains after a day in which neighbors meet with spear points at a border shrine? A city counts its dead, buries them with honors, and reconsiders its treaties. The habit of drilling citizens became a political reality that elites could not ignore. Military service demanded rights to match sacrifices, and constitutions shifted accordingly. The phalanx did not just win battles, it taught a generation how to stand together in more than war. 400 BC naval power before gunpowder. The sea rewarded those who learned to treat water like a road rather than a barrier. Oared galleys turned muscle into motion and allowed states to project strength across straits and archipelagos. A ram of bronze fixed to a sharp prow changed ships from carriers into weapons, and collisions became tactics rather than accidents. When grain ships must reach a hungry city, naval command means food and calm streets. Why does a crew drill for months to master a single formation? The line abreast and the clever feint called the deck plouse depended on timing so precise that one lazy stroke could ruin the plan. Captains studied currents, winds, and the habits of the enemy in order to deliver the one perfect blow to a fragile hull. Boarding actions followed when rams missed, and Marines made decks into temporary cliff tops. The sea favored the trained and punished the sloppy. Dockyards and depots rose as new temples of state power along sheltered bays. Timber crews cataloged forests by quality, and rope makers tied a nation together with cordage that could hold a storm. Paymasters kept oarsmen loyal through lean months, and officials managed the delicate pride of citizen rowers. A navy needed more than ships. It needed the institutions that kept those ships ready at the whistle. Signals and scouting widened horizons in this watery chess. Lookouts on island heights watched for sails and sent word down the chain with beacon fires. When an admiral knows where the enemy must pass, the narrow throat of a channel turns into a trap that favors the patient. Not every battle ended in splinters because blockades and convoy escorts decided more cargoes than rams did. Control at sea meant the option to fight or to starve the other side. What did victory smell like for a sailor who survived a day of ramming and splashing? Tar, smoke, sweat, and the sour tang of spilled wine from ruptured amphorae mixed into memory. Ports welcomed heroes with crowns and songs, but shipwrights soon demanded damaged hulls for the repair yard. The cycle of readiness never stopped, and the lesson that logistics floats on craftsmanship remained anchored in every harbor. 520 BC empires and logistics as weapons. Roads looked dull until an army must cross a mountain with winter close behind. The clever ruler who paves a route and stocks depots at intervals turns a wild hinterland into a reliable corridor. Couriers who exchange horses at way stations make time behave, and commands arrive before crises can grow teeth. A supply line is a pulse that keeps a distant limb alive, and the first empires learned to measure that pulse. Why would a king care about the weight of a grain sack and the diameter of a wheel? Standardization converts chaos into planning, and planning delivers armies to the right place with energy to act. When armor fits and arrows match bow strength, training becomes rhythm rather than struggle. It is not glorious to count nails, yet the army with enough nails will mend its shoes and win the winter. The quiet victories of logistics outweigh the loud ones more often than legends admit. Tax systems and census rolls sound like clerks' obsessions, but they unlocked manpower and money on command. Governors who knew who lived where could levy levies without provoking ruin, and quotas matched to harvest cycles kept fields from going fallow. When a sovereign can summon men and grain by the thousands in a predictable way, neighbors learn respect very quickly. The calendar turned into a campaign plan under careful hands. Engineers became as valuable as champions once rivers and ranges blocked ambitions. Bridges stitched territory together, and forts pinned down newly acquired regions. The empire that built and maintained such structures trained a generation to see geography as a problem to be solved rather than a fence to be obeyed. The will to connect grew into a habit, and that habit outlived many kings. What does a marching column feel when it trusts that a depot waits beyond the next ridge? Confidence moves feet faster than fear, and confidence grows from promises kept. Hot bread, spare sandals, and clear water transform morale from brittle to flexible. A general with a full belly and a dry map reads options where a starving one sees only danger. Logistics became the art that turned possibility into decision. 336 BC combined arms perfected by Macedonia. A young king inherited a drilled infantry and a cavalry elite and decided to weld them into a tempo that enemies could not match. Long pikes anchored a bristling wall that fixed opponents in place, while fast horsemen exploited any sliver of disorder at the edge. Skirmishers chipped away at courage with darts, and engineers carried ladders and ropes like promises. The orchestra of arms played a relentless melody of pressure. Why does a battlefield become simple once momentum belongs to one side? The answer is that choices narrow for the trapped and widen for the free, and the Macedonian method created those conditions on purpose. Feints pulled attention one way, while the decisive strike accelerated in the other direction. Generals who mastered this choreography did not merely attack, they presented the enemy with a series of bad options. That feeling of inevitability broke more lines than spear points alone. March discipline and light supply helped this army outpace rumors. Soldiers carried just enough to make speed an ally, and local resources filled gaps without turning into chaos. Scouts counted wells and crossings with professional calm, and couriers sprinted between columns to keep the picture current. When separate parts of an army share a single view of time and space, unity of effort follows naturally. Sieges did not stall this tradition because ingenuity replaced brute force when walls stood high. Sappers tunneled, towers rolled, and sudden escalades dared the garrison to blink. Artillery that hurled stones and bolts opened gaps that infantry widened. Commanders kept pressure day and night until sleep became the defender's enemy. The same orchestra that played in the open carried its tune to the foot of a wall. What remains once the dust settles in a conquered province? Garrisons secure intersections and treasurers count coin, while envoys offer respectful continuity to local elites. The victor speaks of order and shared prosperity because long campaigns rot without friends. Combined arms on the battlefield required combined measures in politics afterward, and those measures taught future rulers how to stitch new lands into a coherent quilt. 50 BC, the Roman way of war. Legions turned flexibility into a habit and engineering into an everyday craft. Soldiers built roads as they marched and fortified camps every evening, so movement and safety became routine rather than miracles. Standard gear made units interchangeable, and centurions enforced a culture of competence that outlasted individual stars. The army's strength came from its floor, not just its ceiling. Why did Rome care so much about straight roads and solid bridges? Supply follows certainty, and certainty grows where carts can roll without breaking axles. Couriers carried orders at predictable speeds, and that reliability made distant provinces feel closer to the capital than to their rebellious neighbors. A slow and steady drumbeat of movement replaced dramatic charges as the preferred way to wear down threats. Siegecraft reached a systematic level that frightened city fathers into negotiation. Ramp builders measured slopes with the patience of surveyors, and artillery teams set ranges like mathematicians. The promise that no wall stands forever forced choices that saved lives and coin in the long run. Rome invested heavily in the kind of pressure that made courage look wasteful. Auxiliaries added flavors that the legion lacked and extended reach into rough ground and deep forests. Slingers, archers, and light horse brought flexible responses to awkward problems. Officers learned to listen to local experience and to reward initiative in units that were not born in Italy. The blending of strengths across cultures made the army resilient. What does an empire earn when it teaches soldiers to build as well as to fight? The answer is permanence, because roads, aqueducts, and fort lines leave marks that linger beyond the life of a cohort. Veterans settled along frontiers with land grants and became anchors for markets and towns. The military machine generated the civic fabric that fed it, and the feedback loop ran for generations. 450 AD, horse archers and the steppe shock. Across the wide grasslands, mobility turned into doctrine as children learned to ride almost as soon as they could run. A bow fired from a moving horse delivers surprises that infantry dread, and the ability to withdraw at will made these warriors hard to pin. Feigned retreats exploited the eagerness of slower foes, and circles of riders could shower arrows without offering a clean target. Land without fences rewarded the fluid mind. Why does a settled empire fear a foe that seems to scatter under pressure? The fear comes from the cost of chasing ghosts across miles of open country while supply lines grow thin. A city can be defended by walls, but a pasture stretches into risk, and caravans become tempting prizes. Steppe tactics attacked economics as much as formations, and the pain reached the markets before the capital understood the pattern. Allies and subject tribes complicated the map in every season. Confederations formed under charismatic leaders and fractured under stress, yet even a loose network could assemble a terrifying number of hooves when the time felt right. The speed of concentration and the speed of dispersal made pursuit feel pointless. A border that looks quiet in spring can shudder by autumn without warning. Settled states adapted with fortified lines, scouting posts, and treaties that bought time. Light cavalry units trained to shadow raiders and to respond before villages burned. Merchants learned to carry gifts as well as goods, since diplomacy could change an ambush into an escort. The art of managing an open frontier taught capitals humility. What do steppe victories look like from the saddle at dusk? A rider counts arrows left and horses sound enough to run tomorrow, then studies the horizon for signal fires. Glory shines less than survival in this world, and reputation matters more than stone monuments. The memory of today's raid becomes tomorrow's leverage, and that ledger remains open as long as the grass keeps growing. 900 AD stirrups, heavy cavalry, and the knight. A small piece of metal under a boot gave riders the leverage to thrust and strike with new confidence. The stirrup stabilized bodies in the saddle and turned a charging lance into a thunderbolt. Armor thickened to absorb the blow, and horses bred for strength carried more weight over longer ground. The battlefield tilted toward the mounted elite in a way that reshaped society as well as tactics. Why did land and lordship become the currency of military service in this era? Horses eat through winter, and armor costs craft, so men who promised mounted action needed steady income. Estates paid for men at arms and their retinues, and castles rose where obligations met geography. Feudal ties layered loyalty into a hierarchy that could muster force with ritual clarity. The calendar of campaigning began at the Lord's Hall. Infantry did not vanish, but expectations shifted toward holding ground and supporting the decisive charge. Archers pricked pride and opened gaps, while spearmen formed hedges that resisted the first wave. The dance between foot and horse developed new steps as commanders learned patience. A mistimed gallop could waste riches and lives in a moment, and the wise learned to read mud as carefully as banners. Sieges dominated grand strategy because stone defies courage and forces schedules to change. Castles blocked roads and protected granaries, and garrisons turned into communities that knew every trick of the terrain. Attackers hauled timber, iron, and laborers to construct engines that tested mortar and will. Months could pass in the shadow of a wall, and many wars ended at the negotiation table rather than by storm. What do stories remember when knights carry the day in song? They remember honor and rescue and single combat under a clear sky, but veterans remember the grit of gear and the strain of supply. The age of the mounted elite gave Europe a language of chivalry that still colors imagination. Yet the quiet truth is that victory favored the household that managed oats as well as oaths. 1100 AD, the age of the siege. Stone invited patience and punished haste, and that reality defined campaigns across continents. Walls grew thicker, towers rose higher, and gatehouses turned into puzzles of murder holes and angled approaches. Defenders stocked cisterns and grain bins to outlast invaders and trained for sorties that burned siege works at dawn. A city became a machine for denial. Why would an attacker camp under arrow range for months at a time? The prize behind the wall often justified the investment, and the pressure wore down morale faster than rations. Miners listened to the music of stone as they tunneled, and engineers built frames that hurled rocks the size of barrels. The daily grind rewarded stubbornness more than brilliance. Diplomacy threaded through this slow violence in every direction. Clergy carried messages, merchants carried bribes, and exiles carried grudges. A garrison that feared relief might bargain, and a besieger who feared disease might accept oaths. War remained a human negotiation carried out with ropes and ramps rather than only with blades. Artisans earned a place at commanders' tables because their contraptions shortened suffering. Counterweight trebuchets allowed precise work against chosen points, and mantlets protected the muscle that pushed engines forward. Every improvement tightened the vise and taught defenders to innovate in return. The contest of craft and countercraft never slept. What does a dawn surrender feel like to a population that has watched smoke and dust for weeks? There is relief and dread in equal measure, because new rulers bring new rules and new taxes with their mercy. The city survives, but its story changes, and every scar in the stone tells visitors that compromise once saved lives. The siege era taught leaders to weigh time against blood. 1200 AD bow power reimagined. A device that multiplies force with a trigger changed who could deliver deadly accuracy. The crossbow allowed modest training to yield consistent power, and professional guilds supplied bolts that bit deeply. Longbows demanded years of practice, but repaid the investment with rate and range, and communities that trained from youth harvested that advantage. Armorers chased the arrow with thicker plates, and the contest evolved at arrow flight speed. Why would a commander trust lines of archers to decide battle rather than a single heroic charge? A storm of shafts snips courage as surely as it pricks skin, and patterns of fire can bend formations into awkward shapes. Cavalry that rides into a hail risks more than pride, and infantry that pauses under a blackening sky loses nerve. The field turned into geometry rather than a showcase of champions. Manufacture and supply shaped these choices as much as valor did. Bow staves required tall trees and patient seasoning, while crossbow prods demanded specialized materials. Arrows and bolts consumed forests and workshops by the thousand, and fletchers became as vital as blacksmiths. The battlefield revealed the forest and the market hidden inside every quiver. Commanders learned to layer weapons and time volleys with subtle intent. Stakes protected shooters, pikes deterred breakthroughs, and reserves waited to exploit the moment that the enemy lost shape. The notion that a battle could be won by patient accumulation of small advantages gained believers. A new confidence grew in commanders who preferred plans to gambles. What do archers feel when the last quiver empties and the line begins to move? They feel the ache of bow shoulders and the chill of silence after a noisy hour. Their work has either carved a path or failed to open one, and the next minutes carry the verdict. This era taught armies that control of distance equals control of hope. 1350 AD, gunpowder's first thunder. A spark in a chamber shoved pellets of metal forward with a noise that no one could ignore. Bombards battered walls that had mocked stones for centuries, and hand cannons frightened horses and men with flame and smoke. Accuracy at first lagged behind terror, but fear is a weapon in its own right, and garrisons began to rethink bravery. The chemistry of saltpeter, charcoal, and sulfur rewrote architecture. Why would rulers gamble on strange tubes that misfired in the rain? The promise of change outweighed the pain of teething, and every season brought improvements in bore, powder granulation, and ignition. Artisans experimented with new alloys and shapes, and the craft of casting grew from church bells to cannon barrels. A world that once trusted levers began to trust explosions. Cities adapted by building lower, thicker walls with angled faces to deflect iron. Bastions appeared at corners to cover approaches, and moats widened to mock the short range of early pieces. The cost of staying safe rose with every innovation, and treasuries learned the price of silence. Fortification turned into a science rather than a tradition. Infantry absorbed new tools in awkward stages as handgunners joined pike blocks for mutual protection. Drills taught men to fire, step, and reload, while comrades covered them with steel. The habit of cooperation deepened into patterns that could be written down and copied. The outline of a new kind of battlefield emerged through smoke. What do we learn when a thunderclap can crack a gate that heroes once died to climb? We learn that technology can compress courage into a trigger pull and expand reach without adding muscle. The awe that greeted the first guns signaled a turn toward mechanics that would never turn back. The path ahead glowed with sparks. 1550 AD Pike and Shot systems. Discipline became the spine of the battlefield as units drilled to a metronome of commands. Ranks of musketeers delivered volleys, while deep pike squares guarded them from rushing horse. Officers with slender rods kept time and alignment, and colors gave men a place to rally when smoke hid faces. The battlefield sounded like a workshop and looked like a chessboard. Why would a prince invest fortunes in uniforms and permanent regiments? Continuity converts instruction into instinct, and standing forces move from parade to campaign without forgetting. The state that paid regularly and stocked magazines could act in spring rather than pretend in autumn. War became a bureaucratic achievement as much as a personal glory. Arguments swirled among scholars about whether this shift made modern states or whether modern states made this shift. The truth is that cause and effect braided together tightly because money bought time and time taught efficiency. Gun calibers began to standardize, and powder trains acquired rules that reduced accidents. The profession of arms gained a literature and a career ladder. Cavalry adapted by trading lances for pistols and embracing caracole tactics before rediscovering the power of decisive charges at the right moment. Artillery slimmed down and learned to keep pace with marching columns, which forced defenders to respect mobility again. Commanders picked ground with an eye for fields of fire and reserve lanes. The vocabulary of options grew richer. What does a veteran remember from a day spent in a square under pressure? He remembers the shudder in his shoulder from the butt of a firearm, the steady breath of the man to his left, and the drum that kept doubt away. The system mattered because it gave courage a structure, and that structure outlasted any single hero. 1690 AD, the age of sail and naval gunnery. Ships grew tall and broad, and lines of heavy guns turned decks into floating fortresses. Fleets learned to sail in line ahead to bring maximum fire to bear without colliding, and admirals prized steady hands more than flashy gambles. Sea fights became long conversations in iron and smoke that punished mistakes quietly at first and then all at once. The ocean rewarded patience and punished ego. Why would empires pour silver into hulls that took years to build and days to sink? The answer lies in the reach of a fleet that can protect convoys, interdict rivals, and deliver troops to distant shores. Insurance rates and commodity prices moved with the balance of naval power, and merchant families watched battle reports as if they were weather forecasts. Trade lanes turned into arteries that fed capitals. Dockyards became cities within cities, employing carpenters, rope makers, sail loft crews, and foundry workers. Timber rights became strategic assets, and rulers counted old-growth forests like coin piles. Navigation improved with better charts, sextants, and chronometers, and fleets could hold formations across oceans. The map became a ledger of advantage. Tactics shifted toward breaking lines or doubling on the enemy rear when conditions allowed, but the discipline of the line remained king. Captains trained to read wind and smoke and to anticipate their commander's intent even when flags vanished in haze. Naval command was an art of inference as much as command. Decisions ripened with the gust. What did victory feel like when a battered ship creaked home with canvas patched and pumps still working? It felt like the survival of a family that had marched on water and slept beside cannon. The age of sail produced legends and also a sober understanding that logistics and seamanship win wars that poetry only celebrates afterward. 1780 AD War, Money, and the Modern State. Tax offices and central banks rarely appear in paintings of battles. yet they determined who could take the field and for how long. Credit markets lent governments the ability to fight through bad harvests and to pay suppliers on time, which kept arsenals busy. Uniforms and standardized packs gave soldiers predictable loads and commanders predictable performance. The machine of war acquired a budget. Why would citizens consent to higher levies in exchange for distant campaigns? Rulers offered security and opportunity in return, and newspapers helped frame victories as public achievements. Contracts for food, forage, and transport spread wealth through towns and taught a middle class to see war as business. The language of bonds and annuities entered barracks vocabulary. Standing armies acquired staff systems that recorded strengths, losses, and routes with careful detail. Maps improved as surveyors walked and measured, and headquarters learned to coordinate multiple columns moving toward a single aim. The theater of war expanded from single battles to campaigns with seasons and phases. Time joined distance as a factor that planners could manipulate. Reformers pushed for merit selection and training schools to elevate competence over birth in command posts. Drill manuals captured best practices and spread them across borders as freely as music and fashion did. Competition sharpened doctrine and polished equipment, and innovation sped faster than tradition could anchor it. The world of arms joined the world of ideas. What does a citizen army expect in return for obedience and risk? It expects rights, recognition, and a share in decisions that determine its fate. The modern state learned to bargain with its own people in uniform and discovered that consent produces endurance. Money purchased time, and time converted plans into outcomes that reshaped continents. 1805 AD Napoleon, an operational art. Armies learned to move like living organisms that could feed, think, and strike along separate paths that still served a single aim. Corps structures gave commanders independent hands that could march a day apart and still join for battle with cohesion. Staff officers translated intention into routes, timetables, and supply tables that a captain could execute without guesswork. The new rhythm valued tempo over spectacle and turned roads into instruments. Victory began to look like a map solved in stages rather than a duel settled at noon. A question rises when one army seems to be everywhere at once. The answer is that dispersed marches concentrate faster when each part knows where to be and when to arrive with full rations. Lines of operation guided movement toward decisive ground and then swung wide again to mislead and harvest opportunity. Central position allowed a general to pivot against separated foes and beat them in detail before they could clasp hands. Time itself became a weapon that punished hesitation more than poor courage. Logistics adapted to this appetite for motion by mixing magazines with living off the land under rules that tried to restrain chaos. Depots pushed bread and shot forward like an advancing tide, and requisition teams tried to pay or promise in ways that preserved tomorrow's goodwill. Bridges, ferries, and road repairs received as much attention as cavalry screens, since speed dies in mud as surely as it dies under cannon. The general who mastered wagons gained an edge sharper than a saber. Information shaped design before the first shot, and reconnaissance pulled the curtain aside just enough to risk a plan. Light cavalry and skirmishers widened vision, while couriers and signal flags kept the picture current despite dust and fear. Deception masked intentions with feints and false camps that turned caution into paralysis. The contest became a duel of minds that used miles, meals, and minutes like counters. Plans failed often, yet the system forgave error by rewarding initiative at every level. Law, administration, and morale marched in step with the army's boots. Promotions rewarded competence and taught officers to read maps as fluently as they read hearts. Civil codes and new institutions followed flags into annexed regions and promised order in the language of courts and roads. Soldiers believed they served a cause larger than a dynasty, and that conviction steadied lines in storms. The shape of modern campaigning emerged, with movement as its grammar and decision as its music. 1863 AD, industry. Factories poured out rifles that spun bullets along rifled grooves, and that simple twist multiplied range and accuracy in a way no commander could ignore. The mini-type conical bullet shattered bone and cut arteries with grim reliability, transforming open ground into killing space. Smoke lessened with better powder, telegraph lines ran beside rails, and orders crossed a theater in minutes rather than days. The battlefield began to feel like a machine fed by workshops and schedules. Every army learned that railways could replace months of marching with a night of loading and a dawn of arrival. Troop trains filled stations with iron noise, while depots stacked barrels, sacks, and crates in careful rows that represented weeks of fighting endurance. Telegraph offices clicked out situation reports that chiefs digested with maps and pins, and mistakes traveled as quickly as good news. The commander who grasped concentration by rail earned surprises that felt like magic to the enemy. Armored ships prowled rivers and coasts, while new artillery reached farther with steel barrels and better sights. Ironclads denied channels that once belonged to wooden fleets, and forts adapted with heavier guns and earthworks that smothered explosive shells. Balloons rose as sentinels above lines and spotted batteries that would have remained invisible a generation earlier. The air joined land and water as a place to collect knowledge in service of action. Medicine turned from hope to system with field ambulances, organized triage, and hospital trains that pulled wounded away from danger. Surgeons learned antisepsis and transfusion methods that saved lives that would have faded in earlier centuries. The daily ledger of casualties drove reform in sanitation and ration quality, and commanders learned that a healthy army equals a longer campaign. The human cost demanded organization rather than poetry. Entrenchment appeared wherever musketry and artillery punished movement, and spades spoke as loudly as drums. Hasty works grew into elaborate lines with traverses and bomb-proofs, and attacks rehearsed after days of preparation to cut wire and crush parapets. New tactics groped for ways to regain motion under the weight of fire. The age of manufacture had reshaped weapons so thoroughly that doctrine had to learn how to breathe again. 1914 AD World War I, the template of total war. Europe discovered that mobilization plans can outrun politics, and that rail timetables can become fate. Millions formed columns that stretched for miles, and the opening maneuvers crashed into firepower that none had properly understood. Trenches scarred fields from sea to border, and barbed wire turned meadows into traps where courage dissolved under machine guns. The front did not move far, yet the war reached into every home through letters, ration cards, and empty chairs at supper. Artillery became the tyrant of the battlefield, and gunners learned to walk barrages forward in rhythms that infantry could follow. Sound ranging and flash spotting located hidden batteries, while aerial observers circled above with cameras that turned trenches into lines on paper. Gas shells rolled clouds across dugouts and forced masks onto faces, raising fear in a new register. The sky ceased to be a spectator and joined the conversation with reconnaissance and the first fighter duels. The oceans mattered as much as the ditches, since blockades throttled economies and convoys answered submarines with discipline and depth charges. Global empires sent men, animals, and grain from far continents, and the trenches heard languages that had never met before. War finance transformed budgets into bonds bought by families, and propaganda converted complex aims into simple slogans that hung in shop windows. Society traded leisure for endurance and learned new words for sacrifice. Tactics evolved under pressure as stormtroops probed weak seams with grenades, light machine guns, and flamethrowers. Planners synchronized tanks, creeping fire, and low-flying aircraft to punch through and keep moving before reserves could stiffen. Communications teams laid cable behind crawling lines, and pigeons carried emergency messages when shells cut wire. The lesson that only a combined answer could beat entrenched fire settled into doctrine. Hospitals behind the lines pioneered triage on a scale that medicine had never faced. Surgeons worked under new standards of antisepsis, blood storage, and anesthesia, and rehabilitation programs attempted to return broken bodies to work and life. Psychologists struggled to treat shell shock with care rather than contempt, and a generation learned that invisible wounds can feel as heavy as missing limbs. War made science learn faster than comfort preferred. Armistice arrived not as a clean victory parade, but as a negotiation born of exhausted treasuries, exhausted armies, and cities that demanded bread and peace. Borders moved, empires turned into nations, and treaties wrote promises that history soon tested. Military thinkers carried forward a grim understanding that firepower rules until mobility and intelligence join hands. The template of total war lingered in plans and factories long after the mud dried. 1942 AD, mobility and global air-sea power. Engines finally gave armies the pace that theory had prized, and formations fused armor, infantry, artillery, and radios into teams that could break through and then keep breaking. Fuel columns became lifelines, and maintenance companies decided whether speed lasted a day or a month. Air units learned to shield advancing spearheads by blinding enemy eyes and by clawing at supply roads behind the front. Movement turned brief success into decisive change. At sea, aircraft carriers replaced battleships as the core of fleets, and pilots became the long arm that could strike over the horizon. Radar extended sight into night and fog, and code breakers converted intercepted signals into ambushes that felt almost unfair. Submarines hunted convoys that fed distant fronts, while escorts, sonar, and air cover fought to keep routes open. Oceans revealed their size again, yet technology stitched them back together. Strategic bombing promised to crack industry and morale, and bombers reached deeper with navigational aids that aimed at city grids and factory complexes. Defenses replied with fighters, flak, and deception that dimmed cities and confused bomb sites. The struggle between sky and ground multiplied choices for leaders who now had to allocate effort across vast theaters with interlocking needs. Every bomb load represented a trade in a war of trades. Amphibious warfare matured as engineers designed craft that could crawl from surf to sand and unload men and machines under fire. Naval gunfire prepared beaches, while combat engineers cut obstacles and cleared lanes for tanks to climb. Logistics planners invented floating piers, temporary harbors, and fuel pipelines that followed armies inland. The art of landing became a measured science with checklists that saved lives. The first atomic blasts ended a campaign while beginning an age that promised annihilation if misused. Power had condensed into weapons that forced statesmen and generals to face questions that had no comforting answers. The globe had shrunk under aircraft range and radio reach, and war had taught humanity that technology can outpace ethics unless both are trained together. The toolkit of modern force was now complete enough to frighten its owners. 1958 AD, deterrence and limited wars. Nuclear arsenals held great powers in a tense grip where the cost of total war erased the logic of victory. Strategic planners developed doctrines that promised retaliation, certain enough to prevent the first strike, and submarines carrying missiles provided a second heartbeat beneath the waves. Diplomacy, crisis management, and signaling became daily work rather than rare events. The peace that followed felt brittle yet real. Because total war made no sense under this shadow, conflict shifted toward limited aims in regions where rival blocs vied for influence. Insurgencies challenged conventional armies with ambush, propaganda, and patience taught by local terrain and grievances. Counterinsurgency experimented with protection for villages, development for legitimacy, and small unit presence that denied sanctuaries. Success required empathy as much as fire. Technology did not stand still while strategy circled caution. Jet aircraft shrieked higher and faster, surface-to-air missiles rose, and satellites climbed into orbit to watch, listen, and sometimes speak for their owners. Helicopters created vertical mobility that turned ridgelines and jungles into negotiable obstacles. Communications shortened sensor-to-shooter time in ways that earlier commanders could only imagine in dreams. Special operations forces grew from small seeds into professional communities that trained for precision raids, hostage rescues, and advisory roles with partner units. Their value lay in quiet effects at critical moments that avoided large escalations. Political leaders learned to keep options that did not paint them into corners, and those options wore night vision goggles and carried radios linked to distant aircraft. The knife joined the hammer in the toolbox of power. Societies wrestled with the morality of force used under constant media attention, and the law of armed conflict gained stricter rules that soldiers had to know by heart. Uniformed leaders carried cameras beside rifles because proof of correct conduct mattered as much as its reality. Deterrence relied on restraint as much as on strength. The age taught discipline at every scale, from nuclear posture to a checkpoint on a dusty road. 1991 AD, precision, and the Satellite Era. The fusion of stealth, satellites, and digital processing produced strikes that hit the intended aim point with a certainty that changed planning. Global positioning and laser designation gave aircraft and artillery a common language of coordinates and timing. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance layered images, signals, and reports until targets could be identified, tracked, and revisited with speed. The storm of data replaced much of the fog. A question followed quickly once accuracy became routine. If the right aim point can be found and reached without flattening the block around it, should strategy focus on systems and leadership rather than mass destruction? Planners built target sets that peeled back air defenses, cut power grids, and blinded command centers in deliberate waves. Joint operations matured into genuine unity, with air, land, sea, and space speaking one voice. Supply chains embraced barcodes, pallets, and computerized tracking that allowed commanders to see fuel and ammunition on screens rather than only in depots. Maintenance adopted predictive methods that kept fleets ready without waste. The culture of metrics arrived in logistics with graphs that mattered to lives at the front. The rear could now plan with the same clarity that the front demanded. Training shifted into simulators that saved flight hours and ammunition while raising proficiency. Command posts rehearsed campaigns on digital maps that could be rewound and branched like living diagrams. The classroom met the field without a break in continuity. The result was a generation comfortable with screens as weapons and sensors as much as with rifles and radios. The world watched shock and awe on television and argued about ends even as it marveled at means. Policymakers learned that tactical excellence does not guarantee clean strategic outcomes, especially when societies and politics resist tidy lines. Precision gave leaders new tools, but not new wisdom. The lesson that choice of aim matters more than aim point lived on. Networks, cyber, and information warfare. Armed forces discovered that the network itself is a battlefield and that routers and servers can be targets as surely as bridges and airfields. Malware slipped through phishing emails and corrupted industrial controls, while denial attacks smothered services that citizens assume to be as constant as weather. Attribution proved difficult, and ambiguity provided cover for boldness. The silent front expanded into every city with an internet connection. Social media turned narratives into weapons that could sway opinion, recruit allies, or dissolve trust with rumor crafted for speed. Troll farms and bots amplified messages until noise paralyzed sense-making. The defender learned that transparency and rapid truth beat slow perfection, and communicators became as vital as coders. Mines became terrain that demanded guards and guides. Electronic warfare jammed radios, spoofed signals, and blinded sensors that had once seemed invulnerable. Units learned to move with emission control, to harden GPS receivers, and to rehearse analog backups for moments when electrons became hostile. The habit of redundancy returned as a virtue rather than an old-fashioned quirk. Survival required quiet as much as armor. Data fusion promised to give commanders a living picture from drones, satellites, patrols, and open sources in near real time. Artificial intelligence tools began to sift patterns that no human staff could track at scale, flagging anomalies and suggesting courses with probabilities attached. The promise tempted leaders to trust screens that could also deceive if fed poison. Judgment remained the final filter that turned information into wisdom. Law and ethics strained to keep pace with acts that crossed borders without crossing checkpoints. Nations debated whether cyber operations counted as armed attack and what thresholds justified reply. Alliances updated mutual defense language to include networks and cables under the sea. The idea that sovereignty exists in code as well as in land and air reshaped policy. Drones, autonomy, and swarms. Uncrewed systems slipped into the hands of small units and even individuals, and the sky filled with small rotors that could peer into windows or drop grenades into the mouth of a trench. Loitering munitions circled quietly above ridges until a target offered a moment of vulnerability, then dove with precision that earlier ages reserved for elite pilots. Air power arrived in backpacks. The balance between cost and effect tilted hard toward the nimble. Countermeasures chased this new agility with jammers, shotguns, nets, and radar scaled for low, fast profiles. Armies learned to camouflage not only against eyes, but against sensors that detect heat, motion, and signal noise. Urban combat changed quickly as quadcopters turned alleys into glass corridors under constant watch. The perimeter of surprise shrank under persistent eyes. Developers experimented with swarms that coordinate through simple rules to overwhelm defenses through numbers, angles, and timing. Distributed decision-making promised resilience when individual units fell, and resupply methods adapted to feed many mouths rather than a few giants. Commanders considered how to task dozens at once without drowning crews in control chores. Autonomy matured from a clever add-on into a core feature. Logistics discovered a new helper as small aircraft carried blood, medical kits, and critical parts across rough ground at any hour. Naval units launched tiny scouts that extended horizon and warning without risking large crews. Land robots dragged supplies behind patrols and scouted culverts and doorways that swallow the unwary. The dull work that exhausts humans began to migrate to machines that do not tire. Law and morality confronted the question of responsibility in a chain that includes code as well as people. Rules demanded clear accountability for target selection and the use of force, and training drilled crews to keep a human decision at the critical step. Transparency and audit trails joined doctrine so that trust could survive success and failure alike. The public learned new vocabulary alongside the soldiers. The human-machine frontier. Command posts now hum with assistants that recommend routes, allocate munitions, and forecast enemy actions based on patterns across many sensors. These tools do not command, but they frame possibilities in ways that speed choice and reveal risk that a tired staff might miss in the small hours. Leaders learn to ask better questions and to cross-check suggestions with field truth. The art of command bends, yet it does not break. Robots on land search buildings, diffuse explosives, and carry loads that once bent backs into early injury. Surface and underwater craft patrol harbors and extend sonar nets, while aerial teammates watch roads and farms for movement and dust. Human teams guide, retask, and recover these helpers while keeping eyes on civilians and rules that protect them. The partnership feels new, yet it grows more natural every month. Training transforms as synthetic environments allow squads to rehearse a village, a valley, or a ship deck built from real scans. Repetition turns rare crises into familiar problems, and after action tools replay choices with clarity that once depended on memory alone. Units arrive in theater with shared experience earned far from danger. The time between learning and doing shrinks to a breath. Medical care benefits as sensors monitor fatigue, dehydration, and stress in ways that warn before errors or accidents occur. Evacuation platforms coordinate with ground units and hospitals as if they share a single heartbeat, and telemedicine reaches into forward posts to guide skilled hands. Recovery includes mental health as a core mission rather than a whispered afterthought. The force becomes stronger by caring for itself. Ethics remains the compass that must be checked at every turn, because tools that multiply power can also multiply harm if judgment fails. Leaders codify human-in-the-loop decision points, audit systems for bias, and invite civilian oversight to keep trust unbroken. War has always tested character, and the test now includes restraint beside innovation. The frontier is not a place on a map, but a commitment carried in every order and every act. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more ominous history videos. See you in the next one.